Thank you all for being here. I'm Channing. I am one of the members of the leadership committee for SOFLUX, and I'm very excited to be introducing Elise today, who's a postdoc at Avi, working as part of the SOSHIC project and currently looking at PCO2 and air CO2 flux variability in the Weddell-Sea. She did her PhD at UEA, studying carbon uptake in sea ice covered regions at both of the poles. And so today she's going to be telling us about some of that work, specifically on the role of sea ice in regulating interannual variability of carbon fluxes along the Western Arctic Peninsula. So with that, I will just turn it over to Elise and say thank you again for presenting.
Yeah, thank you very much for a nice introduction, Channing, and also for inviting me to give a seminar in this series. So yeah, like you said, today I'd like to share with you some of the work I did for my PhD, which I recently finished at the University of East Anglia, where Dorothee Bagger was my primary supervisor, and Hugh Venables, Mario Hopema, Giorgio Dal Olmo, and Bastian Kist were also co-supervisors. So I'd like to acknowledge all the people that are mentioned on this slide here, because they have provided various inputs and contributions to this work. And actually that's also ongoing, since I'm working on publishing this work as well. Also a shout out to the marine assistants who over the years have been collecting samples at Rothera Research Station, upon which all of this that I'm about to show you is based. So instead of talking a little bit more about the title of this talk and what I'll be showing you, I thought I'm going to try something different and just jump straight into it and show you this graph right here, which is actually one of the main outcomes of this piece of work. So what you see here is a time series of observational data in the Southern Ocean between the end of 2010 until 2020 of the CO2 flux. So whenever we see positive values here, that indicates we've got outgassing from the ocean to the atmosphere, and negative values mean CO2 uptake. I've also plotted the sea ice in the background. You can ignore the different colors for now, because what I'd like to talk about, and maybe you've noticed this already, are two things. First of all, this is it's a time series with year-round data, and we could see a lot of, very strong seasonal variability here, not just in the sea ice. So you can already see this is a seasonally sea ice covered region, but we see very strong CO2 uptake in the melting season at this stationary location, and also CO2 outgassing in the winter months. And the second thing that you might have noticed already is that besides the seasonal variability, we have quite a lot of interannual variability represented here as well. We see this in the sea ice, where we have years with less sea ice cover than other years. We see this in the CO2 uptake in the melting season, sea ice melting season. And we also see this in the amount of CO2 outgassing in the wintertime. And that last part, so the outgassing in the wintertime and its interannual variability, is what I would like to really, just discuss with you today and show you some of my findings. Because this data set is very rich and there's a lot to see and discuss. But as you know, we don't have a lot of wintertime observational in situ data in the Southern Ocean. So I personally found that very interesting, and I just want to share that with you. So there's a couple of themes that will be maybe popping up in this talk that you can look out for. And that is the preconditioning role that sea ice cover can have on the water column, and by extent then also its chemical properties. The importance of interseasonal dependencies, which is why these long-term year-round monitoring programs are so valuable, one of the reasons. And also, this is quite a rare time series to have, and I like to think about what we can learn from this time series and how we can apply those lessons to other parts of the Southern Ocean, which even though we are increasing our understanding in so many ways, there's still so much that we still need to figure out. So I will continue with actually giving you a little bit more context to this time series, where it's located, and the methods that went into resulting into this graph that you see before you now. Excuse me. So yeah, the time series that I just showed you, which is almost a decade long, is actually a part of a longer time series, which is called the Rothera time series. This is a time series maintained by the British Antarctic Survey at Rothera Research Station, located next to Ryder Bay here in the West Antarctic Peninsula. In the zoom in part of this figure, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but you can see that Ryder Bay, and it's a relatively smallish bay, I guess. Its maximum depth is about 500 meters. And in the middle of the bay, they have a sampling site called Site 1, and that's their main sampling site where observations are collected. And sites number 2 and 3 are there as backup sites in case adverse weather conditions or sea ice conditions don't allow them to get to the middle of the bay. So in the late 90s, they started this time series with CTD profiles, which also included fluorescence measurements. They also would collect a discrete seawater sample at 15 meters depth for the analysis of macronutrients. And they would repeat this collection of data relatively frequently in the summer, so maybe twice a week or at least every week. And in the wintertime, the frequency would decrease a bit, maybe every week or every 2 weeks or so, whenever conditions would allow, because we all know it's quite tough to get out there. Then in 2002, in addition to what they had before, they also collected an additional seawater sample at 15 meters depth for the analysis of stable oxygen isotopes. And then in 2020, they added another set of variables or another sample, also at 15 meters, for the analysis of dissolved inorganic carbon and total alkalinity. And from these two variables, we can calculate things such as the partial pressure of CO2, although I'll be referring mostly to the fugacity of CO2 since that also accounts for non-ideal gas behavior, but it's numerically almost the same. And from that, we can also derive the sea air CO2 flux, of course. So I mean, this is a really rich data set, and it's very, I mean, it's really nice because we can look at what we're seeing in terms of the carbonic chemistry at this location and place it into context, into behind all these other variables such as nutrients and meltwater input and what is happening deeper in the water column. Yeah, so so they go out, so you see a picture how this happens. They go out in a small boat to the middle of the bay to do these measurements. Here on the right, I'm showing you the only the results. So yeah, so even though we have CTD profiles since late 90s, I'm also only focusing on the last 10 years when we also have the carbonic chemistry data. So you can see the temperature and salinity profiles. At the bottom, also showing you the chlorophyll derived from the fluorescence. I'm not going to be focusing on that at all really today, but I just wanted to show you for completion a most coherent overview of what's being done. Well, you can see that, so these profiles only go until 200 meters, but you can see that at depth we have this high, saltier and slightly warmer water, and that is modified circumpolar deep water that, flows along the shelf of the West Antarctic Peninsula, and some of it manages to flow onto the shelf itself and navigate through deep troughs, reaching all the way to Ryder Bay. And it is modified on its way due to surface layer processes. And so this is the main water mass that we find there, and it is freshened in the summer, in the spring and summertime at the surface by meltwater, sea ice and glacial meltwater input. And you can see in the magenta lines in the top two plots, you can see the mixed layer depth, which increases in the winter. And this mixing is induced mainly by wind-driven mixing in this region. And then it stratifies very strongly again in the summertime. Oops. Right, and so as I mentioned, in 2002, they also started collecting samples for the analysis of stable oxygen isotopes. So this is the oxygen in the water molecule, and we're actually looking at ratios of two different oxygen isotopes, and we do denote that as the delta O18 variable. And it is considered to be a conservative tracer away from the surface in the ocean, similarly to salinity. And it's also affected in similar ways as salinity, but not when it comes to sea ice formation. So as we know, when sea ice forms, brine is rejected and the seawater, the salinity in the seawater increases, but delta O18 does not fractionate in any way. So this decouples these two conservative tracers, and that allows us to use it in a 3-component mass balance method, as you can see here, which when we have the end members of 3 different water masses, we can derive their representative fractions at the surface where the sample was collected. And so these water masses are the modified circumpolar deep water, which I mentioned before, and then of course the sea ice meltwater and the meteoric water input, which in our case will be the glacial meltwater, as that was once precipitation, of course. I'm not going to do into a lot of detail here, but it's been a method that's been widely used, and specifically also for Ryder baying. I've added some references at the bottom here in case you guys want to have a little bit more information there. And then we come to the de-icing alkalinity. So yeah, just a little refresher. I'm not sure it's necessary, but DIC content is the content of all the dissolved inorganic carbon species, as you can see here at the top. And alkalinity is considered to be similar to the buffering capacity of the ocean, and it can be defined as the hydrogen ion equivalent of the excess proton acceptors over proton donors. And de-icing alkalinity, so the sample is just one sample, as you can see in the top right-hand corner, and it's analyzed for these 2 variables back in the lab on land in the UK, well, specifically at UEA, on a Vinta, which is what you see in the bottom picture. Again, I don't really want to dwell on the methods here. Of course, do feel free to ask me about it afterwards, or have a look at some of the references that I listed here. And so the first 3 years of this carbonate chemistry time series of the Rotherham time series have been published by Oliver Legg back in 2015 and 16. And he really dug into quantifying the drivers, the processes behind the seasonal variability that we see here. And he found that this sharp decrease that we see in DIC and alkalinity in the spring and the summer season is driven by biological carbon uptake, as we have quite sustained phytoplankton blooms there. Then as we move into autumn, CO2 uptake from the atmosphere is an important factor for the increase we see in DIC. And in the winter, the main driver behind the increase in DIC and alkalinity is the mixing of the surface water with this more carbon-rich modified circumpolar deep water. So that's an important source for both of these variables. And so since then, we have extended this time series, of course, until 2020. And that's what you can see here, just to give you a bit of an overview. I've color-coded these variables according to how well they correlate to each other. So for example, well, even though DIC and alkalinity, they both sharply decrease in the melting season and increase in the winter season, the timings of their increase and decrease sometimes can vary. And so, for example, alkalinity is much more closely correlated to the contribution of circumpolar deep water to the surface and salinity. And then fugacity of CO2 and DIC and nutrients. So here, for example, nitrate, they're more closely correlated. So just the point being that even though we have processes that affect both in similar ways, there are some processes that are more strongly affect DIC and therefore also the fugacity of CO2, such as the CO2 uptake and also respiration and biological CO2 uptake in the melting season. So using that information and we can, and a software program such as PyCO2 SIS, we can derive other components of the marine carbonate system, such as fugacity of CO2. And I've shown you, so I'm showing you fugacity of CO2 here in the second panel from the top. But what I actually find slightly maybe more useful in this context, variable to look at is delta FCO2, which is the difference in FCO2 between the seawater and the atmosphere. So whenever it's positive, we have potential CO2 outgassing, of course, and negative is potential CO2 uptake. And I say potential because whether the flux actually occurs depends on whether direct gas exchange is possible, which if you have complete sea ice cover is, of course, heavily limited. And in the top panel, you can see the results for this. So in the wintertime, the delta FCO2 is usually positive, meaning that we have potential CO2 outgassing, or it is near equilibrium. And it's this delta FCO2 that also decides the sign of our CO2 flux, which also, of course, depends on solubility of CO2 in seawater and the gas transfer velocity, and which is heavily dependent on wind. We scale the CO2 flux with the fraction of open water in Ryder Bay, which is quite a simple way to account for the effect of sea ice cover on direct gas exchange. We know, of course, that it's not as simple as that, but until we have a better understanding of how to incorporate these this impact, this is how we do it for now. So there's a lot to say about this time series, and there's a lot happening in there, but as I mentioned before, I'll only be focusing on the wintertime parts of it with you today. And so what you'll see in the next slide is only the mean values of delta FCO2 and CO2 flux in the winter times only for each of these years. And I want to have a look at, what might be behind the interannual variability in those mean values of those winter seasons. So here I've plotted the winter mean delta FCO2 against the number of days that we have fast sea ice cover above 80% in Ryder Bay. And what you can see, what you'll notice is that in years when we have a winter with not that many days of sea ice cover, we tend to have a mean delta FCO2 in the winter that is more positive versus years when we have much more sea ice cover, when we actually see a delta FCO2 that's less positive or even negative, suggesting we could potentially have CO2 uptake if direct gas exchange were possible. When we look at the same plot, but then for the CO2, the mean winter CO2 flux, this relationship that we see is, of course, a little bit distorted. That is because as we have more sea ice cover, the sea ice cover limits dampens the CO2 flux. So we have a bit of a flattening of this relationship with more sea ice days. And this is also why when I was working on this, I prioritized really looking at what is driving the change, the differences in the delta FCO2 between the winters of different years, instead of the CO2 flux, because there's just so much more to think about. So that's also what will be what I'll be focusing on in this talk today. And the reason that this relationship seems to exist between the delta FCO2 in the surface ocean and the sea ice cover is through the effect of sea ice on the structure of the water column, and specifically its stratification. So previous studies, and now I'm only showing those actually specifically for Ryder Bay, so using the same time series, have looked at this. And there's a study by Hugh Venables and Mike Meredith published in 2014. And what they did is they looked at the Rotherham time series, and they divided each of the years between years that had a winter with high stratification and a relatively low stratification. And they did this based on a similar plot as the one I'm showing you in the middle of this slide. So they plotted the mean winter stratification in the top 100 meters versus the mean winter mixed layer depth. And they made a decision, and they said, okay, any winters that have a mixed layer depth that is deeper than 50 meters and has a stratification in the top 100 meters less than 1500 joule per meter, we'll classify those winters as deep mixing, low stratification winters, and the others as shallow mixing, high stratification winters. And this threshold is not, I mean, it's relatively arbitrary, it's not rigid, and it's not absolute, and that's also not the point. It's just, we just want to have a see which years, a look which years are more similar to each other, and can be based on that then also see patterns in other aspects of the water column. So on the left-hand side, you can see how these 2 years are divided. At the top, we have our shallow mixing winter years, and these are years when we have relatively high, or like a lot of, well, high sea ice years, so long sea ice duration. And at the bottom, we have the low sea ice years, which coincide with deeper mixing and lower stratification years. So what is happening is that when we have less sea ice, we have more wind-induced mixing that's causing these deeper mixed layer depths and lower stratification. So if we know that the modified circumpolar deep water is richer in carbon, and that's also the main driver of the increase in carbon at the surface in wintertime, by extension, can we then also say that in years when we have a long sea ice duration, high stratification, so shallow mixing, do we then also see less or lower delta FCO2? And when we have less sea ice and low stratification, do we then see higher delta FCO2 values? So here on the right-hand side, I'm showing the same plot as I showed you on the previous slide, and you can see the two groups, or how we've categorized these winters among low stratification and high stratification years. So there is an association. So the low stratification years do tend to have a higher delta FCO2, but it's not a completely predictive relationship, of course. So we have a preconditioning, but that's not the whole story. And as an example, I would like to give you or show you the winter of 2014. I mean, it's a bit obscured now by these bad choice of placement of my circles here, but I'm going to give you 2014 as an example, because that's a year when we had quite a lot of mixing in the winter, which is also why it was classified as a low stratification winter. But we have a delta FCO2 that is slightly negative or near equilibrium with the atmosphere. So what happened there to break that, to decouple the effect of sea ice on the delta FCO2? And that's actually because we need to be looking at what happened before. So in 2014, we actually have the deepest mixed layer depth recorded for this part of the time series. You can see that here in the magenta lines, and it resulted in a cooling and a freshening of the water column until about 200 meters depth. And the reason that this happened is actually because in the just prior, well, in the melting season before this winter in 2014, the melting sea ice was dynamically diverged towards the Western Antarctic Peninsula coastline by anomalous winds, and this all this affected, let's say, sea ice was then melted in situ. And this is reflected in an enhanced peak in the sea ice meltwater input that you can see at the bottom. So when we have these, when the winds mixed, will cause this deep mixing, what it was actually doing was diluting the upper water column, and so not just diluting salinity, but also keeping the content of DIC relatively low compared to other winters. And this is also why we see a lower delta FCO2, and it shows that well, the importance of these interseasonal dependencies, which we can only really understand and study if we have year-round data. So this was just an example for that. And other studies for Ryder Bay have investigated this further. So on the left-hand side, you already see what I mentioned before based on the work by Venables and Meredith. So this association of sea ice to the water column structure, but this is not only relevant for the winter itself, it also kind of propagates to what happens in then the subsequent the melt season. So here's an example from Rosama et al., also based on the Rothera time series, where they looked at the effect of high sea ice and low sea ice winter on the stratification of the subsequent spring and summer. So when we have high stratification in winter, we tend tend to have a higher stratification in the spring and subsequent spring and summer as well. This affects the biomass of the phytoplankton blooms, and not only that, it could also, as in this example, affect the microorganism community structure, and that of course has implications with biochemistry and biogeochemical cycling, such as the nutrients and carbon in the surface ocean. So this is a nice example for that and how everything is interconnected. So until now, it seems like what is driving this interannual variability in the wintertime delta F CO2 is mainly driven by physical processes. So the effect of wind-driven mixing and how sea ice kind of regulates the effect of that. And even though that's maybe the dominant driver, I also wanted to explore whether we can see any changes in the carbonic chemistry that are due to biogeochemical processes in the winter time. And one way we can look at that is by plotting total alkalinity against DIC, as you can see in the top theoretical plot. And depending on how data points move in time relative to each other, we can say something about what could the most likely process be that is affecting the water at that stage. So for example, if we have DIC content that is increasing over time, but total alkalinity remains relatively constant, then we can say, well, probably CO2 uptake was an important process there. And so the other processes represented here are net photosynthesis and also net calcium carbonate dissolution. So I wanted to apply this for all the individual samples collected in all of the winter time in our time series. But before doing that, I normalized DIC and alkalinity to salinity to remove most of the physical processes that were actually affecting both of these variables shown through their correlation with salinity. So anyway, so that's what you can see here at the bottom, salinity normalized alkalinity versus DIC. And most of these individual samples collected in winter, they tend to cluster around the same values. But some of them deviate along this calcium carbonate dissolution line. So just to be clear, these lines that I've drawn on there, their position in the graph, it doesn't matter because it's all relative. So what, based on these ideas, what it suggests is that there could be signs for calcium carbonate dissolution in the winter time in the water column underneath the sea ice for at least some of these samples in some of these years. And that would have contributed to the variability we see within the wintertime itself. These processes were not strong enough to affect interannual variability necessarily. But yeah, it maybe in the first sight it might seem a little bit puzzling because we're in the winter time, and the calcium carbonate that we're talking about here, by the way, would likely be or possibly be the ecait that is formed in the brine channels of sea ice when it forms. So as we're talking about the winter time, wouldn't it be more logical to see calcium carbonate, signs of calcium carbonate formation? But what might have happened here is that calcium carbonate within the sea ice matrix itself might have escaped the matrix during sea ice dynamics and breakup of sea ice because of diverging sea ice within Ryder Bay. And if that calcium carbonate then was released to the ocean below in those periods of time, it could have dissolved in situ and led to these relatively enhanced levels of salinity normalized alkalinity and DIC. So how, it's still a bit unclear how much these processes have contributed to the overall variability, but it's something fun to think about and maybe also consider for other sampling activities. And yeah, one last note is that based on this method of looking at it, I couldn't really see any clear dominant role of remineralization happening in wintertime. But yeah, I should also add, it's a little bit difficult. We have to be a little bit careful about thinking about these processes using this type of way to show the data, because the water that is sampled at one time point is not necessarily exactly the same water that we sampled 1 or 2 weeks before, of course. So a lot could have happened between then, and it's not necessarily how to say, yeah, it's not necessarily the same water mass that we're sampling. So other processes might have happened in the meantime. Another nice way, I think, to look at the CO2 uptake is by plotting the CO2 flux in terms of its cumulative value. So what this graph would show is the total CO2 that has been taken up in Ryder Bay since the beginning, or since the end of 2010 until 2020. There's multiple lines in this graph, but the only one you should really be looking at right now is the dashed orange line here, because that is the CO2 flux that I've been talking about until now. So yeah, you can see that overall, every year or most years, Ryder Bay takes up more CO2 than what it releases in the wintertime. What I found maybe quite exciting is that there are some years when this outgassing is very, very little. And if you look at it in this manner, it kind of suggests that there are some years when the CO2, net CO2 sink is more efficient than in others because we have less outgassing. And the examples here are 2015 and 16, which are also 2 years that were classified as high stratification years. And that was because they're high sea ice years. We have lots of sea ice there. And that's because in 2015, we had an El Nino coinciding with a positive southern annular mode. And that resulted in anomalous cold temperatures at this part of the West Antarctic Peninsula. So we have a very strong sea ice year in 2015. And the cold temperatures also, in a way, preconditioned an early sea ice season in 2016. And for those of you working on the larger Southern Ocean, will be aware that in 2016, was actually known as a year where sea ice in the Southern Ocean decreased really rapidly or early in the season. And that is not reflected here in Ryder Bay, where the winds actually pushed whatever sea ice was still remaining towards the coastline. And this is why we have an extraordinarily long sea ice season in Ryder Bay up until beginning of 2017, actually. So my first point is that in years when we tend to have high sea ice years and high stratification, those years could also generally be more efficient CO2 sinks. And the second part that I'm leading up to is that what we see here in the Rutherford time series is not necessarily completely representative of larger scales of other parts of the Southern Ocean. And that brings me to this slide, and this was near the end of my work, where I attempted to zoom out a little bit and think, okay, what can we see in the Rutherford time series, and how does that compare to, for example, a data product of the larger time series? So the data product that I chose was the one produced by Landschützer et al. And they use the SOCAT PCO2 data in a neural network technique to, in a very smart way, interpolate and extrapolate PCO2 and CO2 flux, and by extension CO2 flux, in times and regions where we have very little or no data. There's several boxes shown here in this map, but you can ignore all of them except for the orange one, box A, which encompasses both Ryder Bay and Margaret Bay, which is right next to Ryder Bay, actually. And so Ryder Bay itself, of course, is a very small coastal place, but it has been shown that the processes happening there in the ocean are quite representative for what's happening in the ocean in Margaret Bay. So I think we could see the carbonate chemistry time series of Ryder Bay as representative for Margaret Bay possibly as well. So here on the right-hand side, what you see is the delta F CO2 and CO2 flux again. In black is the Rutherford time series that I've shown you until now. And then you can ignore all the rest except for the orange one, which is the mean values of these two variables in box number A of this data observation database product by Landschützer et al. And this is a data product, by the way, that's also often used to compare to model output and also validate model output. And what you can see is that, well, so the black line, as we talked about before, has interannual and seasonal variability, and also this interannual variability in the wintertime. The orange line shows that there is also this strong interannual variability in the amount of CO2 uptake and negative delta FCO2 values from year to year in each melting season. But what it does not really seem to capture or show is the interannual variability in the wintertime outgassing or positive delta FCO2 values like we see in Ryder Bay. And there of course could be multiple reasons for this, and maybe one of the reasons is that this data product uses a climatological mixed layer depth. So perhaps even though the sea ice is included in this technique, and therefore also the interannual variability of sea ice, the effect on the water column maybe is not as captured as well. Here at the bottom, we see the CO2 flux for this product. And you can see that even though in Ryder Bay, we have positive fluxes in the wintertime and varying positive fluxes. In the wintertime, in the product results, there's actually nothing much happening, and it's all very constant as well. There's not a lot of variability happening in this region. And that's not just because we assume it's completely covered by sea ice and therefore there's no direct exchange. It is also because the delta FCO2 shows that it barely gets above equilibrium with the atmosphere. So maybe so it's interesting to compare these two larger regions. And even though Ryder Bay in itself is not representative, maybe the processes in other regions could be interesting to study. And yeah, this is like this in the same line of argument. How well do we understand the wintertime CO2 outgassing, especially in the sea ice covered part of the Southern Ocean? We have studies using float data, such as by Gray et al. And Bashinsky et al., that show that maybe we are underestimating the outgassing seasonally in the sea ice covered region of the Southern Ocean, and also we have this discrepancy between model output and observation-based products on the whole Southern Ocean, interannual variability and seasonal variability. So I think if we approach these problems using multiple platforms, since each of them have a lot to offer, maybe we can zone into what is it exactly that we don't understand, what's happening in the winter, and how can we improve that understanding. And with that, I will take you to my last slide here, where I just want to emphasize how important sea ice is in its preconditioning of the water column. And even though that's not all, because what happens prior to the winter, so in the previous season, can also be very important in understanding what happens in the next season. So this is the importance of the interseasonal dependencies. And I think this rather red time series is quite rare to have in this way. And I think, yeah, it will be nice to have a look at it and see how what we can learn from it and apply it to other parts of the Southern Ocean too. So yeah, so with that, thank you so much for listening. I can't see anyone, so I don't know, but I'm open for any questions you may have. And yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much, Elise. That was really great. I really appreciated your perspectives. So we can open it up for questions now. Feel free to either just raise your hand or you can pop it in the chat. Lily, I think I see your hand up.
Yeah, hi Elise. This was such a cool talk. I'm thinking about very similar questions, and I am would like to talk to you further at some point. But
awesome. Yeah.
Right now, I'm very curious about where is the sea ice that is in this region? Where is it like originally sourced from? Because I imagine it's not locally produced.
Yes, oops, sorry. I stopped. Did I stop sharing or did you, can you still see
No, you've
anything?
stopped sharing, I think.
Oh, okay, sorry. I just wanted to take you to the map. So we can, it's easier to talk about. Let me share again. Yes. So thank you for your question, Lily. Sea ice is also formed locally in this region, but I think, I mean, there's also a lot of sea ice that is dynamically moved around and then would therefore come from Margaret Bay and also from the western side of these islands over here. But it is also formed locally, and questions regarding that I've gotten before related to this work is, you know, can we not see a clear signal of local sea ice formation, so this brine rejection and enhanced salinity input? But the main process, well, the words, the strongest influence on what is changing the like salinity profile in the lead up to winter, so in autumn, is mainly wind driven mixing. So even though sea ice is also formed locally, it's has less of an influence on the water column than wind driven mixing.
Very cool. Thank you. Appreciate it.
So I think next we can go to Tiago's question in the chat. So the question is, how do you classify the types of sea ice? And if you observe differences in the processes controlling FCO2 among the different types of sea ice? And then finally, do you have any feelings about whether different types of sea ice might influence air sea CO2 fluxes differently?
Yeah, thank you, Tiago, for your question. So the way that the sea ice cover and also the type of sea ice is determined is actually by the people working at Rothera there, and they visually assess the sea ice cover within Ryder Bay, and also what type of sea ice cover is present in that moment. So this is visually done because a lot of, well, because it's such a small region, it's a bit difficult to use satellite data maybe, but there is some interesting possibilities to maybe compare these in situ observations to high resolution sea ice products. So yeah, so that is how it's done. And your question was about how these different types of sea ice might be affecting CO2 flux. That is also a very, very cool question, which I don't quite know how it would directly affect the flux, but if, sorry, I just want to take you to a different slide at the end. But you know, what we can think about, for example, if when we calculate the CO2 flux in this method, which types of sea ice do we include in, oh, here we go, in this calculation? So, because, okay, so the different types of sea ice are shown here. We've got brash ice, grease ice, pancake, etc. And brash ice, you know, it's not completely covered. You can imagine that there is still some flux happening, but we just don't know how much is that actually influencing the flux itself. So what I have done is I've calculated the CO2 flux and then scaled it with sea ice cover, but you know, maybe I've only used, so here you can see I've the orange dashed line shows the CO2 flux scaled according to using all sea ice. Doesn't matter if it's brash or grease, pancake, pack, everything. And then I've also done it when I only use the fast sea ice, all ice except for the brash, because brash is also often present in the summer months. So you can see that it, you know, depending on what we use to scale the CO2 flux with, of course, it will affect the CO2 flux. How, like, mechanically, let's say, brash ice affects the CO2 flux versus complete, like, fast sea ice with, you know, high or low porosity, that I don't know. I'm sure it will have an effect, but that is a really cool part of the sea ice science that some people are working on. Because yeah, and it's also not just the type of sea ice that is important, but then also, you know, the temperature of the sea ice, which affects the porosity of the sea ice, and therefore this connection between the brine channels and the atmosphere and the water below. So a very complicated question, and I'm sorry I did not really have a good answer to that, but it's a really fun topic to think about.
Any other questions for Elise? I can ask a question then while people are thinking. One question or one thing that struck me was when I saw the title of your talk, I sort of assumed naively that the damping effect of sea ice would be really important in the interannual variability. So I was quite struck actually by the fact that it seemed like really the difference in delta FCO2 was really the driver of the differences in the interannual variability rather than the actual, you know, sea ice cover preventing exchange. And so I know you were connecting that to differences in the mixed layer depth, but I was wondering if you thought there could potentially be a role for like differences in on-shelf transport of modified circumpolar deep water or like other larger scale circulation that could be affecting like the vertical gradient of DIC that can be entrained, or if they're just wondering if you had any thoughts about that sort of side of things, because I found that to be really, really interesting.
Yeah, thank you for your question. Yeah, exactly. So of course the presence of sea ice cover will have an effect on the CO2 flux itself. So I mean, yeah, obviously if it's all completely covered, there's not much happening. But yeah, the delta FCO2 does change from year to year. And I agree that if we have a different ocean circulation, or we have well, different ocean circulation, so different inputs of water masses, or the properties of the modified circumpolar deep water that we see in Ryder Bay, if that changes, then I think it would also have an influence on, you know, once it mixes with the surface ocean, on its chemical properties, including DIC and alkalinity. So I mean, this is a beautiful time series. One of the things, you know, if we had infinite resources and funding and time, what I would love to see is a profile, of course, of DIC and alkalinity, because then we would be you know, it would be easier to assess this influence from this deeper water up until the surface, and we can look at these gradients. So all we have now is just one depth, 15 meters, and that's it. So so how much of an influence like it has in this part of the time series is difficult, but I do believe that it could affect what's happening in the surface for sure. So yeah, if we look at other regions where I mean, I don't know that much about the northern part of the West Antarctic Peninsula, but so North Antarctic Peninsula, but there, you know, you have also input from Weddell Sea, deeper waters there. And so I think, yeah, if you have interannual variability in the inputs of different water masses, that I think would have an effect on the interannual variability in wintertime as well. Yes.
Thank you. So there's a question from Bruno about whether there's a polynya in this region.
Hi, Bruno. No, not as such. So I don't, in Ryder Bay, I don't think there's really a polynya, but what does happen is that in winter sometimes the ice just breaks up, and then there is a bit of open water, but I think that quickly closes again through sea ice dynamics, or sea ice is formed in situ. But at least in Ryder Bay, oh, Hugh's going to say something. I probably said it wrong. So Hugh is the expert there. Hi, Hugh. Good to see you.
Hi. So I thought
answer.
I'd jump in on this one.
Go for it.
We do have open water in winter, which you could quite reasonably call a polynya. But in years with less winter sea ice, there is less winter sea ice cover, so more open water. There is less sea ice produced, going by surface salinity budgets. So it's not a polynya in a classic sense of form sea ice but have it blown away. When there's open water, it's because it's a bit warmer, and the ice is blown away in one go, but it doesn't have a sort of sea ice production effects in the way that some more classic polynyas do. So it kind of depends on your definition of polynya or what you then assume is happening if you call it a polynya. But it is open water in winter.
Well, I mean, because there have been this discussion about the type of ice, and rather than the type of ice, I was questioning if they have these coastal polynyas that are known to be ice factories that produce a lot of ice with effect on the turbulence and things like that. So rather than the change between land-fast ice over pack ice, I was questioning is the time period where there is more pack ice. The reason was can be these coastal polynyas that are known to be ice factories and can have a lot of impact of the water layer. It was my question.
Yeah, no, and then the deep mixing is wind driven. If you look at the salinity patterns and also some of the mixing processes that have been observed with ADCPs, it's a wind driven effect more than a brine rejection effect on the mixing.
Great. So I think Tiago also has a question about long-term trends. And so further to the north at Palmer Station and Gerlach Strait, there's been a decrease in the delta PCO2 that's been observed there from summer 2012 onwards. So he was just wondering if there was any sort of similar trend in Rothera.
No, I have looked at this specifically for the summer months over time as well. Actually to compare to this study, but no, so I didn't. Can you remind me, Tiago, there was also it also had to do with the mixed layer depth. There was also a trend there, right? And I think for Rothera, in any case, it was not the same. So that would, that also shows that even, along the West Antarctic Peninsula itself, we have latitudinal gradients or differences, I should say, in how trends are moving in terms of delta PCO2 and mixed layer depth. But I need to, I want to compare back to that study too and see what exactly the differences are.
Does anyone else have other questions? Oh, Alex, go for it.
Really nice talk, Elise.
Thank you.
I wondered if you wanted to just indulge us all in some wild speculation about what you think is going to happen in the next 20 years as we appear to transition to some very low sea ice years, particularly at Rothera, where we had no fast ice at all last winter. So, just wondering if you wanted to indulge us with some speculation, I guess.
Yeah, thank you. Well, the thing is, I mean, if mixing is indeed the main process that is happening in winter, and that is affecting the content of de-icing alkalinity at the surface, and if we have, and if that connectivity between the surface and the deep water in winter is regulated by the presence of sea ice, it protecting it from wind-induced mixing. If the sea ice is just disappearing and the sea ice season is just going to be becoming shorter and shorter or starting later and later, I would speculate that we'll just have more or deeper mixing and therefore a stronger connectivity between the surface and the deep. And so more of this deeper, older carbon will be brought to the surface. Not only increasing the delta PCO2 there, but also, since there's not a lot of sea ice covered to restrict direct gas exchange, that CO2 will just be released to the atmosphere. And there's not, there's no, not a lot of other biogeochemical processes that could mitigate that because we don't have much light. So there's no phytoplankton. So I think we'll just see, I think Ryder Bay could become a much less efficient as a CO2 sink region, and maybe even become a net CO2 source to the atmosphere over time with these trends. Yeah.
Thanks.
So we have time for maybe just one or two more questions if anyone has final thoughts, but if not, that's fine too. Great. Well, I think that's not the worst note to end on as well, with some thoughts to the future. So I think we can all thank Elise again for a really wonderful presentation. I certainly learned a lot and really enjoyed it. So thanks so much for speaking with us.